Hi, everybody. Today is Monday, March 10th, 2025, and our friend Colonel Jacques Baud is back with us. Welcome back, Colonel.
Thank you very much for inviting me again. Thank you.
Let's get started with the situation in Syria. It seems that it's getting out of the hand as we've been talking about it various times. And here is what the in reaction to what has happened in Syria, what the European Union is talking about. They're talking about European Union strongly condemns the recent attacks reportedly by pro-Assad elements on interim government forces in the coastal areas of Syria and all violence against civilians. It's so tricky when you look at this note, this little note that they have published on their X account. And on the other hand, we've learned that Russia and the United States are asking for a UN Security Council today. They're going to have a meeting today talking about Syria. It seems that it shows that how important is the situation right now in Syria. What's your take on what's going on?
Well, first of all, as you rightly said, this was expected. I mean, we had when the transition happened last December, we had already troubles and we had massacres and all that. Our media tended to hide this because the idea was that Assad is a bad guy, and therefore everything that replaces him is good. And of course, the whole issue about the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which was basically considered as a terrorist movement, including al-Julani, who have a bounty on his head at the time. Okay, that was quietly discarded, and we whitened Julani. He changed his military uniform into a suit and tie attire, and his name changed also. And therefore, I mean, Al-Julani was a so-called nom de guerre. So that's a name you take when you go to war. By the way, that means Al-Golani. That Al-Julani is the way to pronounce it, but if you pronounce it the Egyptian way, it's Al-Golani. That means he comes from the Golan, which gives us some idea about his relationship to the Golan, and that should be a source of worry for Israel probably in the longer run. But that's another question. In any case, we knew that this transition, even if Bashar al-Assad apparently negotiated a peaceful transition, and that was his condition to leave his position and leave the country. But this was not totally so peaceful. And obviously, what we have today are probably the result of this lack of peacefulness, let's put it that way. Because, again, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is a fundamentalist party, essentially. So the way it would coexist with other ethnic and religious groups was a question mark. That was totally ignored by the West because the bad guy was Bashar al-Assad, which, by the way, I still have to have. I mean, we should probably study a little bit more what kind of crimes he was accused of, because I'm not sure, even if I'm not discarding the idea that his army did some war crime, as it happened with any army. But I'm not sure it was systematic. And I think the whole idea of having Bashar al-Assad out of Syria was to split Syria, which has been a constant aim of the Israeli policy for Syria. That was to split it in 2 or 3 or 4 parts, depending on the time and the model. In any case, we didn't know. We didn't know exactly how Al-Julani or Al-Shara, as his name is, how he would manage the situation with other groups. And apparently this didn't go well, since you have this kind of rebellion And the pictures that I've seen, again, I'm not suggesting that this is an exhaustive understanding of the situation, but what I've seen is that you have civilians who have suffered from the repression provided by the HTS, because as it is today, there is no regular army as such, it's a militia in essence, the HTS. And as long as you don't have a government that has been acknowledged, accepted, with elections and all that, you cannot expect the population to accept just a government and the rule of one faction, one religion, especially if this faction is, as we know, a rather extreme one. Therefore, I think the small post that you showed from the European External Service of Kaja Kallas, when you see that, I think it's extremely reckless to say to put this kind of thing. But that reflects the way the European Union addressed not just the situation in Syria, but also the situation in Israel and the situation in Ukraine. It's the partisan approach to the problem. And this partisan approach cannot lead to, let's say, a peaceful solution. And we see, we'll probably discuss that later, that what we have in Ukraine is precisely the kind of dead end in which the European diplomacy is. Because when you address a situation in a partisan way, then you don't have any escape. You come in front of the wall, and that's exactly what we have. And that's a situation we have in Syria. Very interesting to see that in Syria, you had a transition in early December last year. And now, after 3 months, there is apparently no real, let's say, action from the West try to anticipate the problem that would come out of this strange situation. Of course, you had the visit of Annalena Baerbock and all that, because as soon as it is an ally of Israel, she would come, even if it's a terrorist or a mass murderer. But that's how she is. After all, she even said that the civilian population that don't deserve protection when terrorists are among those civilians. That this is a very strange approach to international humanitarian law, but it's a fact. So we had those visits, but beyond this, I haven't seen any active, let's say, diplomatic action to help the new Syrian authorities to create something in Syria. The Western, especially Europeans in that case, took for granted the fact that the new government is the new government, that it will be accepted by everyone. And we are back to this kind of mindset that we see in both in Palestine and in Ukraine, by the way, or let's say Ukraine, Russia. It's this idea that everybody hated Bashar al-Assad. He was a dictator. He was widely hated by the population. And therefore, everything that can replace it is positive. And you have exactly the same attitude toward the Hamas, from the European Union. And exactly the same thing about Putin. There is no understanding that the mindset in those countries can be more complex than the black and white picture we have in Europe. This is, in essence, when you think about it, this is exactly probably what we had in the 16th century when the Spanish colonial forces arrived in South America, or things like this. How can you think differently than we do? Because we have the right, we have the truth. And that's exactly what we I feel with European Union today. They have only one way of thinking, and everybody has to think the same way. And we cannot even imagine that anybody could think differently. So changing or removing Bashar al-Assad is in the interest of everybody, period. And therefore, there is no need for accommodating the new government in Syria, or helping them to manage the connection with different ethnic and religious groups. So this is a kind of a reaction from the West, which is not really surprising. What is surprising, and that's we'll have probably the same point with the European Union, is that within the European Union, to take an example, I mean, I could take individual countries, of course, but within the European Union, you have an intelligence service, an intelligence analytical service. It's not a service that collects information as such. It's more an analytical service. And you would expect that the measures taken by the European Union would be first explained, or let's say supported by some analysis of the situation, some assessment that would understand what is at stake in the country XYZ. In that case, Syria, and in other case could be Ukraine or even Russia. But it doesn't seem so. Even if these institutions do exist, I remember that I worked with the head of the intelligence in the European Union. He was a German guy, but okay, that's a long time ago. In any case, I have the feeling that decisions are taken or not taken in total absence of any objective, impartial analysis of the situation, as an intelligence service would do. And we have the same thing in the individual countries. We'll probably talk about what's happening in Europe and the address of Emmanuel Macron and all that. But when they speak, you can ask yourself, where did they get this information? This has been partly already debunked, even in the media. So it's a lie, essentially. And some assertions needs to be probably more or less categorical, because we don't know exactly what happened and all that. But certainly when we don't know exactly, we cannot base decision on something we don't know. And this is this very strange. Again, I speak from an intelligence perspective, because that was my job in the strategic intelligence. You advise the minister, you advise the decision makers, and you expect the decision maker, when he takes his decision, to take into account the assessment the professionals made, because obviously a president, a minister, whoever, is not an expert in the situation, and therefore he relies, or should rely, on the experience and analysis of those who are specialized on that, who receive special, let's say, overt or covert information, or information from covert sources and all that, meaning that you can expect those decision makers to base this decision on a very comprehensive, or the most possible comprehensive picture of the situation. But it's apparently not the case. They decide or don't decide on the base on their feelings, and not on solid intelligence and analysis. And that's exactly what we are seeing at play in Syria. By the way, very interesting to see that today, although everybody speculated about the presence, the Russian presence in Syria, many people said, well, that's the end for Vladimir Putin. He will have to leave and all that. It's not the case. And apparently it's exactly the opposite, that Turkey, Syria, and even the Israelis asked the Russian to stay in Syria. And what you see today is that those population that are subject to repression by the current government in Syria, they took refuge in the Russian military bases. You see? So we see here this upside down picture that we have. Today, those who help saving lives are the Russians, not the Westerners. The Westerners are on the side of those who make repression. They're not on the side of those who support civilian populations. And I think it's a very interesting picture that we have today. And again, I don't know exactly. I didn't follow the detail of what's happening, and I've seen that you have on the whole coast, the Mediterranean coast, from Latakia down to the Lebanese border, you had clashes between populations and the HTS. Now, it's I think I said population and not rebels, because apparently it's just broader than simply just the clash between militias. It's, as a matter of fact, a clash between the HTS and the local populations. And so it's broader than simply a clash between militias. And that, in turn, is explained, or not explained, but put the finger on the lack of ability of the Western community to react to such situations. In fact, in Syria, if we look at large, I mean, we take some distance, even distance on the timeline, we could see that we have destroyed this land. We, the Europeans, we have fueled the rebellion in 2011. And the Europeans are certainly part of it. The Americans certainly are the part, because those who rebelled in 2011 were essentially people coming from Iraq. In fact, extremists coming from Iraq and coming into Syria, and eventually they create a force that was sufficiently strong to destabilize the country. And that's where, in fact, the Islamic State emerged. And it was deliberate from the French government, the US government, probably the British, but essentially the French, definitely. And everybody, I mean, even at that time, even Laurent Fabius, who used to be the Minister of Foreign Affairs of France, he was saying that the Hayat al-Sham, I mean, that was the Jabhat al-Nusra at that time, meaning that they were doing good work. So the French decisively created a destabilization of Syria together with the US. So we destabilized this country. This country never managed to recover from that destabilization. What we have today is the result of a reckless policy and foreign policy that the West used for the sake of splitting Syria, and therefore making the work for the Israelis. Because at the end of the day, the Israelis were those who, let's say, sponsored this idea of splitting this large country that used to be Syria into smaller factions. When I say faction, I do that on purpose, because the idea, and that was the famous plan Aded Yinon, which was elaborated by an advisor to Netanyahu and was taken by a think tank, a U.S. think tank initially, and under the and taken over by Yinon to advise Netanyahu in the 90s. And the idea was to have Syria so split that they would fight against each other and don't not even attacking Israel. So it is kind of for Israel, it was the idea of security by creating chaos. It's a kind of a divide and rule policy that Israel had. So this is the situation we have, and that explains why the Europeans, in fact, are marching along, coming along with Israel on that, and never managed to keep Syria as a viable, centralized, and let's say normal, I would say, state. They, in fact, made every effort to subvert the government by helping the Kurds, which, by the way, also affects the Turks, and by creating, and that was what John Kerry confessed a few years ago when he said that the West, in fact, let's say, favored the emergence of the Israeli state. The Islamic State, sorry. So this is what we have today is a consequence of a reckless policy. I hope that the Syrians will find a way to work together. The problem is that you have so much emotion in that conflict that I'm a little bit pessimistic about that.
Carl, here is what let me just bring the news here. Here is what the energy sector of Israel is talking about, the providing energy to Gaza. And here is what, let me just, Israeli Energy Minister Eli Cohen, he has signed an order to cut off electricity to Gaza Strip immediately. How do you see the situation with the ceasefire between Israel and Gazans and Palestinians? Is that gonna last? Is that gonna work? Are we gonna see the second phase of the ceasefire, or Donald Trump would not be able to force Netanyahu to continue in the process of ceasefire?
Well, the thing is that we know from the very beginning that Israel will not comply with the ceasefire process, I would say. The first phase of this process was clear because in that phase you had the release of those prisoners on both sides. And that was the main, let's say, point of interest for Israel. The later stages, the second phase would be that the military, in essence, I'm summarizing a little bit, but the second phase would be that the military leaves completely the Gaza Strip, and the third phase would be the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip, in essence. So we knew that the Israelis want to have the prisoners back, but don't want to leave Gaza, meaning that there were little chance that we could reach the phase or the step 2 of the process. And by experience, we have seen, and I think we can document that the Israelis have never complied with any agreement they have signed. Never. At one point or another, they have breached the agreement. And more recently, we had the agreement or the ceasefire in South Lebanon. And the Israelis, they consider that their own interests go beyond the value of their signature. And therefore, they are entitled to breach the agreement they signed. And we have seen that, as I said, in South Lebanon. We have seen that several times. I mean, if you look at all the ceasefires that have been in place in Gaza before the 7th of October 2023, but you had a huge amount of small ceasefire between Israel and the Palestinian factions. It was systematically each time broken by the Israelis. And then, of course, they complained, because it's interesting, by the way, that for the Israelis, killing or bombing a house or an area where you are a chief of a Palestinian faction is supposed to be, is not considered as a breach of the ceasefire. It's very interesting policy, but they have said that. It's not my interpretation. They have declared that officially, that they don't consider that as a breach of the ceasefire. And therefore, even when you had a ceasefire in place, they came and bombed an area, killing some Palestinians. And therefore, and of course, for the Palestinians, it's a breach. And therefore, they reacted by shooting rockets. And the Israeli says, well, we didn't breach the agreement. And the Palestinian fired the rockets. Therefore, they are terrorists. So we have this kind of dynamic. That's exactly, I've reported that in my book, because I checked every single ceasefire and checked how was it broken and what was the real, let's say, timeline for each event. And I've seen that this is systematically breached by the Israelis. So I think it was expected that would happen this time. And here again, we are a little bit in a similar situation as in Syria. What is interesting here is the inability of the Western world, who is so keen to protect values and to protect civilians and to protect the rule of law and to protect the international law and all that. They have absolutely no intent whatsoever to interfere with the situation and try to prevent Israel breaching the agreements. Because we knew it would happen. But again, you have absolutely no preparation whatsoever, no plan, no action, no diplomatic action, nothing. Not even sanctions. And that's I think, is extremely concerning. I mean, we have mentioned that exactly for the minority, the Alawi minority in Syria. We see exactly the same scenario, but the Palestinians. And we see exactly the same thing in Ukraine. They are supporting a faction for war, and they are not even, they are partisans, and they are totally unable to take some distance and try to have a mediating role for these conflicts. And that's very strange. I have said many times, I understand a Palestinian fighting for his territory. I understand an Israeli fighting for what he thinks is his territory. I don't understand the method, because then you have to comply with the rule of law, and not the rule of law, the international humanitarian law, or the law of war, if you prefer. So that must be clear. So the way of doing it has no excuse. But I understand that in the mindset of an Israeli, he defends his country and his population. The same as you have a Palestinian that says the same thing. And I understand both. I understand that both have a radical position. because they are involved in a conflict. That's exactly the same thing between a Russian and a Ukrainian. I understand both of them. I understand that Zelensky could be angry in the Oval Office. I understand that. The problem is that we, especially Europeans, and I'm a little bit talking as a Swiss also, we are not involved in those conflicts. We can afford to have a more balanced understanding of a problem. We can afford to be a mediator in these conflicts. We can afford to be impartial. We can afford to be objective in assessing the conflict because we have no reason to be involved. And the international community should take advantage of that to have a positive role in those conflicts. That should be the role of the UN and another organization, by the way. The problem is that we are not even willing to do so. We are partisans. And we see that, probably discuss that about Ukraine. When you see European Union about Ukraine, I mean, it's almost fanatical position against Russia. And it's almost an equally fanatical position against the Palestinians. Almost an equally fanatical position against the Alawi population in Syria because allegedly they are pro-Assad. And Assad has not even any intention to come back in Syria. So what does pro-Assad mean? But we are totally unable to take distance with those conflicts. And that's exactly where we have the problem here. The international community has not the willingness, the tools, the ability, and I would say even the intellect. Because at the end of the day, this is missing. We don't understand these conflicts. We understand them as we perceive them, but not as they are. And that's exactly what the Europeans are discovering in Ukraine today, because they are probably a little bit closer to Ukraine than they are to Palestine. But now, today, they are realizing that their perception of the conflict is totally besides the reality. And we have exactly the same issue in Palestine, that we are not realizing that yet because we still work on kind of prejudice and things like this. So Palestinians are bad guys, and especially today in Europe, if you go in France, even in Germany to some extent, you have a lot of a very strong Muslim presence. These countries never managed to integrate those Muslims properly. They kept them in some kind of let's say second track society, and therefore today they have created a sub society in the societies, and therefore today you have clashes that start to emerge. You find that in France is very strong, in Germany it starts also, and in the UK. And therefore our picture, because again, when you talk about terrorism, the first thing people think of is, of course, Islamist terrorism. When the Ukrainians bomb or sponsor any terrorist activities in Russia, this is not terrorism. This is accepted. But when it is Islamic terrorists performing attacks here, then that's terrorist. And terrorist is clearly linked with Islamic, the notion of Islam. And therefore, Palestinians are basically, and I remember this French politician who said, Hamas has attacked France. How come? Well, he explained, because Hamas is Islamist, Islamist was Islamic State has attacked France, therefore Hamas attacked France. This is the logic. And this is the kind of politicians we have today. It's impossible to solve problem with those people. They're not problem solvers. They are problem makers. They're troublemakers. Because regardless of what you feel about Muslims, terrorists, what, making some kind of shortcuts to try to explain a situation and making or let's say suggesting that the situation in Palestine is the same as the situation France experienced in 2015, 2016. This is so simplistic. I would say it's so juvenile and so immature. How can you build a policy based on that? That, I think, it's the problem we have in the West. So I don't want to discuss exactly, because you had hundreds of violations of the ceasefire by the Israelis in the Gaza Strip, and we don't want to discuss all of them. But what strikes me again, this is the inability of the West to enforce the agreements that were passed and accepted by both parties, the inability to enforce the international humanitarian law. And that's not just after the ceasefire was signed, but even before the 7th of October. And that shows an inherent weakness of the West. We have absolutely no leverage. And when you ask what Trump can achieve with Netanyahu and all that, I don't know what kind of leverage Trump has towards Netanyahu. First of all, Trump is not pro-Palestinian. He's not even pro-peace. He just wants to put his money in other places than these conflicts. That's all. Trump has an extremely opportunistic understanding of these conflicts. I mean, these are not his conflicts. That applies both to Ukraine and to Palestine. These are conflicts that were initiated under the Biden administrations, were conflict triggered and supported by the Democrats. For him, it's a waste of money, a waste of resources, and a waste of time. And therefore, he doesn't want to support them. But I'm not sure he will be ready to defend or protect the Palestinians. He will protect the U.S., what he considers as the U.S. national interest, which is essentially to have a trade war with China and to make America great again, period. The rest is just second priority items, and there is no need to spend too much time and money for that. And therefore, even his project on Gaza, that was just probably just words, because I don't think he has even seriously considered to have that implemented in some way. But let's put it aside. But Trump he will not spend time and money and energy to protect the Palestinians. He could, and he is probably right in a certain way in saying that the Israeli-Palestinian problem is a problem that the US tried to solve in the last 50 years or so. With the Camp David agreements, and you had the Oslo Accords, all that was done under the auspices of the US. And you note that even if the Europeans were basically at the root of the problem, they're absolutely not present in the whole process. Again, we are seeing exactly the same thing in Ukraine or in Syria or elsewhere. The Europeans are just making trouble, but they don't have the necessary unity. They are not able to mobilize the necessary resources. They're not even willing to do so, to solve the problem. And that's exactly, by the way, when I make the comparison all the time with Ukraine, because it's exactly what we are witnessing with Ukraine today. They are not trying to solve the problem. They're trying to take advantage of the problem some way. But they have absolutely no instrument, no process to solve the situation. They are fighting the problem, but they're not solving the problem. And that's where I think they're so desperate to see the split between US and Europe. Because again, regardless of what we think about Trump and all his predecessors, the US have spent more energy than the Europeans to solve the problem in Palestine. They have not been very successful, at least because the Israelis don't want to do things. So that's a major problem. But those who tried, at least, were the Americans. We have to acknowledge that. Again, whether it was successful or not, we can discuss that. They probably made mistakes. We can agree on that. And they probably supported the wrong side on several occasions. We can agree on that. Absolutely. But on the other hand, at least they tried. While if you look at the European side, we have never seen the same kind of effort to try finding a solution. And today, you could say that previously, before the European Union existed, you had individual countries, but those individual countries were so split among each other by their own interests that they never managed to have a common ground to solve the Israeli-Palestinian situation. Once you have the European Union, you could say, okay, there is a government, a kind of overhead for all these countries. You have some kind of government, even if it's not elected and all that, but let's put it aside. But at least you have a structure, and you have institutions like the European External Action Service, for instance, which is the foreign affairs of the European Union. So you could expect these institutions to have enough resources to try to do something. But it's not the case. They're totally unable. And with Kaya Kallas, who was the brain of a bird, she's focused on Russia. So there's no way she can understand anything about Palestine and the Middle East. I'm not sure even she traveled in those areas. I'm not even sure she understands the mindset and the kind of relationship you have between communities in the Middle East. These people from the north, and that's very true with the Nordic countries, and I include the Baltic states, especially the Baltic state, who have been focused all the time on the Russian threat. And they have absolutely no interest about. You can see that even immigration and things like this are not even their topic, because they have very strict laws about immigration, first of all, and nobody wants to go there. Therefore, they don't have the problem. They don't have the same kind of issue like France, Greece, or Italy, which are at the southern border of, or Spain, which are the southern border of Europe and have the flow of immigration that comes from the African continent. So the Baltics, they don't even have that. So meaning that they never had to cope with other mentalities than the one they have. And we see that they are very unable to assess the situation there. So when you have a foreign minister of the European Union, which comes from one of the smallest states of the European Union, which is Estonia, which is always focused on the hate on Russia, how can you expect the foreign policy to be a problem solver in Palestine? Even when when she was Kaya Kallas was selected as foreign minister, I think the focus was to maintain this kind of Russophobia somehow, but not to have European Union having kind of a presence in the world, a presence that is beyond, because we know, again, uh, whatever we think about the United States, they have their national interests, they work according to that, and therefore they make wars and all that. Okay. Uh, we can argue about China, we can argue about Russia, but we could expect from an area such as European Union to be in between of all these interests and having an interest to stability, because at the end of the day, stability is exactly the reason why the European Union was created. And as opposed to what Trump said, European Union was not created to be adversary to United States. On the contrary, the European Union was designed in some way by the US at the beginning of the Cold War. Why? Because the European Union, the US at that time understood that, especially under Eisenhower presidency, they understood that the Europeans have very huge problems accommodating their own national interests. And therefore, they needed to be bound by some kind of treaty. That's the reason why the Americans supported the reconstruction of Europe. That was a way for them to create a stable society against the threat of the communists bloc at that time. And they tried to create a process that would merge the different countries into something stable, because what the Americans needed against the Soviet bloc was a stable Europe, Western Europe. And that's what they created, or that's what they tried to create. That's the essence of the European Union. And we see that everything happened because when it's nice weather, no problem. The problem comes with bad weather. That's exactly what we had with Ukraine. And not just on the 24th of February 2022, but even before that, from 2014, the European Union was not able to take his role of a stabilizing factor in Europe. And on the contrary, she took side and contributed to the destabilization of the situation in Ukraine. And we have seen that with the non-respect of the Minsk agreement and all that. But what I mean with that is that European has never realized that it could play a stabilizing role in not just in continental Europe, but also with its neighbors in Northern Africa, in the Middle East. Of course, you have some institutions, I mean, within NATO and also within the European Union, I mean, within at the under the framework of the European Union and under NATO, you have the so-called Mediterranean dialogue on both organizations, which is the dialogue between NATO and a certain number of countries. I don't remember exactly the number. I think it's 6 or 8 North African and Middle East countries, which are the Mediterranean dialogue for NATO. And you have something similar with European Union, meaning that they acknowledge the need of having a dialogue with the other side of the Mediterranean. But beyond sitting in meeting rooms, we don't see an active, let's say, a role of the foreign policy on that. Meaning that when you have problems, and we have definitely with Israel today and mounting tensions between Egypt and Israel and Saudi Arabia and others, but they never realized that they could play a role, a stabilizing role within this region, because they are the main economic partners, meaning that they could have some kind of leverage, kind of a trade or economic leverage that they are not even able to use because they have no they don't have the intellectual readiness to do that. See the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia that I just mentioned and Iran, that was done by China, not with the European Union. Who would be the natural beneficiary of that? That would be the European Union. But China is wiser. They understood that there is something to gain having this stability in the Middle East, because for China, these are trade partners. Therefore, if you want to expand your trade, if you want to have some kind of a win-win situation, if you want to build up your own network of friends and all that, it was probably a good idea to engineer some kind of a partnership, or at least a peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So we see kind of a long-term thinking, not just related, it's not for the sake of having Mohammed bin Salman shaking hand with Khamenei. This was not the idea, but the idea is to build something on which you can build later. And that's very much a Chinese approach, which is extremely strategic, extremely long-term oriented. In Europe, you don't have that at all. The European foreign policy has not identified that at all. Even during the Ukrainian war, Joseph Borrell never managed to expand relationship with other countries. Their own focus was, how can we manage isolating Russia? It was not to expand their network of friends. And that's exactly the problem I think we see. I see as a European looking at what's happening in Palestine and Syria, beyond the what's happened on the ground, obviously, which are all these violations. But we are unable to. We don't have leverage. We have never developed any tools to influence, to manage the conflicts. Therefore, we rely on the Americans. And if the Americans don't want to do that, nobody will do. And that's, I think, a little bit what Netanyahu is trying to exploit, because he knows that Trump doesn't want to be involved in those conflicts. Therefore, somehow Netanyahu has some kind of free hand to do whatever he wants. If you add to this that Trump doesn't like, especially the Palestinians, at the end of the day, Netanyahu has carte blanche, as we say in French, to do whatever he wants.
Here is, Colonel, when it comes to the conflict in Ukraine, here is what Donald Trump said in his latest interview on Fox News.
The fact that you walked away and Ukraine may not survive?
Well, it may not survive anyway, but, we have some weaknesses with Russia. It takes two. Look, it was not going to happen, that war, and it happened. So now we're stuck with this mess. Think of what he stuck me with.
Yeah. The way that he's talking about Ukraine, he sees a huge sort of problem for the United States in Ukraine. He wants to get rid of the problem in Ukraine. He's so desperate in achieving that. And on the other hand, we know that he's going to talk with Ukrainians in Saudi Arabia the same way that he talked with Russia. How do you see the dynamic between the United States and European Union right now, considering the case of Ukraine? Is it getting easier for Donald Trump to deal with? Is it Or are they gonna, or Donald Trump would see some sort of unprecedented resistance coming from Europe in case of Ukraine, for the case of Ukraine, supporting Ukraine?
Well, the main difference between Trump and the European Union is that Trump has an idea regarding what he wants with this conflict. We can argue whether it's good or bad, but that's his view. He wants to get rid of this conflict. It's a liability for him, and he wants to get disengaged of this conflict. It's not his conflict. This is something that was started by his predecessor. He thinks it was a bad policy, it was bad investment, and in addition to that, it led nowhere. And today, nobody has a sensible solution in sight. Therefore, the best way for him is to force the two main parties to sit together and to settle the question. That's what he sees. But he has an advantage as regarding to the Europeans. He has an idea. He has a strategy. He has an objective. If you look on the other side, the Europeans, they triggered the conflict. They helped to fuel the conflict by providing weapons and all that. They're also in their rhetoric, including not just as individual countries level, but also at European Union level. As we just said, the European diplomacy was totally unable to find some way in solving the conflict. They don't want to have that, by the way. They don't want to talk to Russia anyway. So I mean that the European diplomacy is totally inexistent. Even with Blinken, there was something. Even if Blinken had a very negative role in all that, I agree on that. But at least you had a diplomacy. When we talked about diplomacy and the Ukraine conflict, everybody talked about Lavrov and Blinken. Even if, again, Blinken had a negative role. But when we talk about Europe, I think the Europeans cannot even think that, don't even know the name of the guy who was in charge of diplomacy during the last 3 years of conflict, which was Josep Borrell. Nobody knows because the European diplomacy was totally inactive. And beyond that, I mean, at the end of the day, diplomacy is just one of the tools to fulfill an objective and to implement a strategy. But again, when you look at what the Europeans want with Ukraine, you don't see any strategy and you don't see any objective. You see, if you could say, okay, by adding 100 tanks, we could achieve victory. And victory will be defined like this, that, and that. Then you would say, okay, then you try to achieve victory. But the problem is that in Europe today, nobody is able to define what victory could be for Ukraine. And nobody is even able to understand what could be understood as a defeat of Russia. But we still continue to fuel the conflict. And in a war of attrition, and that's the war that Russia is waging against Ukraine. And I remember what, I'll remind you that what General Surovikin, the then head of the armed forces, Russian armed forces in Ukraine, on the 18th of October 2022, he said, our strategy is to grind down the Ukrainian forces. It's not to take territory. So, meaning that in a war of attrition, you cannot measure the success in square kilometers. You measure it in the number of adversaries you have killed. This figure is not known. I mean, it's only known by the Ukrainians and the Russians. That's all. Meaning that every day, for each passing day, we are supporting the Russian strategy. That's what it what it means. So, meaning that the more you delay political solution of the conflict, the more you help Russia to fulfill its attrition strategy. If the strategy, the attrition strategy, would be reversed, that means if the Ukraine had all the cards in hand, the problem would be probably different. We could, but today everybody knows in Europe that the situation for Ukraine is not positive. I mean, you can take the problem from the direction you want. It is adverse to Ukraine, and that's the question Trump is trying to answer or not answering. At the end, what do we expect from Ukraine? Will Ukraine still exist? We don't know that. And each passing day, Ukraine is becoming smaller. And everybody knows that. But since nobody has elaborate or thought about another strategy than just providing weapons, we continue on the same path. The Europeans have been, in fact, the architects of Ukraine defeat. I'm not even mentioning the fact that the equipment that were delivered by the Europeans to the Ukrainians in the last 3 years were equipment that were not fit for combat, that were not adapted for this kind of warfare. That was very much the case of the Caesar, the so-called the Caesar howitzer, the French part, which is a very good equipment, by the way, technically perfect, but not suited for this kind of war, not suited for a high rate of fire that you find on the battlefield. As a result, this excellent equipment was misused and didn't allow to achieve success. Other equipments, the Leopard 1, for instance, because we tried to give Leopard 2, which was probably the better tanks that the Europeans had in the early 2024. But this equipment, or early 2023, sorry, was already provided some Leopard tank for this so-called counter-offensive that happened in the summer 2023. So they provide tank Leopard 2, but those were almost all destroyed. And then the Europeans could only provide Leopard 1 from the 50s, early 60s. And this equipment was obviously not adequate against the T-90s and the T-64Bs from the Russians and all that. So the Europeans provided equipment that was just surplus weapons. They didn't want to spend too much. So they helped Ukraine by helping without helping. As a result, it was almost impossible for Ukraine to achieve any kind of success. And today we are continuing on the same path in Europe. At least if we look from the US point of view, the US has a clear strategy. Their focus is on China, on rebuilding US economy, US industry, US production capabilities, and so on and so forth, and therefore to have this trade war against their most threatening competitor, which is China. That's the main focus. And everything that is besides this must be eliminated. This is just waste of money, waste of energy, waste of resources, period. And therefore, the Americans, Trump in this case, want to get rid of that. And it doesn't feel like a defeat. because it's not his war. While for the Europeans, that's their war, making it more difficult to get out of what you have created yourself. Therefore, the Americans have here an advantage because Trump is new. He can say, this is not my work. This is the work of my predecessor. That was stupid thing, and we can change things. Macron cannot say that. The same as Olaf Scholz. I mean, he will change, but all the others, because they have supported this war so far. So they cannot change their mind so quickly. And that's the kind of conundrum in which we are here in Ukraine. We see that there is a total absence of strategic thinking. And that was blatant, as we could see how unprepared were the Europeans after the Munich conference and the first meetings that you had between Russia and the Americans. By the way, very important to say that the Americans and the Russians so far have not talked about the peace in Ukraine. That was not the issue. The issue was to reestablish dialogue channels, to reestablish the normal diplomatic relationships between the two countries. That's all what they did. If you read the press in Europe, they said, well, the Americans and the Russians will negotiate the peace and they will force the Ukrainians to accept that. This is not the idea, at least so far. The idea was reestablish the diplomatic relationships. And then what Trump will do, and he has already announced that, by the way, he will force both parties, I mean, Russia and Ukraine, to go and sit at the same table to talk about the conflict. That's why he threatened both of them of sanctions. And since the Russians have indicated their readiness to talk, that's why Trump has applied not sanctions, but let's say has stopped physically its support to Ukraine in order to push Zelensky to the negotiation table. But in essence, what will happen is something, or what the way the conflict will be solved is a discussion between Ukraine and the Russians. The problem is for the Europeans, because the Europeans have been the tabakis, as Putin said. You know, tabaki is the small animal in the Lion King cartoon movie, where this is a very tiny animal. He's jumping around the Lion King, and he basically, this is the kind of people who just scream and try to inflame the situation, but they don't have the capabilities of influence things. They are just screaming around, you know. And that's exactly what we have with the Europeans. They are not in a position to influence things, and therefore they try to be present at the negotiation table. But what for? They're against any kind of peace, and everything that was proposed by Emmanuel Macron, Keir Starmer, is not about peace. This is about giving kind of security guarantees to Ukraine. And they give those security guarantees because they haven't understood. I mean, the address, I mean, Emmanuel Macron gave an address to the French people. It was on Friday night. And he, in essence, he said that we have to prepare because Russia wants to attack us, which is totally stupid. I mean, there was absolutely no indication of that. The Russians have never indicated that. But the thing is that the French and the French elites, I would say, or the European elites at large, and probably a large part of the population, has a distorted perception of the conflict. This is this idea that Russia is expanding, try to rebuild the Soviet Union, rebuild the Tsarist empire and things like this. And therefore, people feel threatened by Russia. Although the essence of the conflict in Ukraine has nothing to do, not even with NATO, in fact. The reason why the Russians entered in Ukraine was to protect the population of Donbass. Period. Obviously, the background of that and the reason why Ukraine wanted to attack the population of Donbass is because of their membership to NATO and all that. So, in the background of that, you have NATO. But Russia didn't attack Ukraine to attack NATO. It was definitely to protect and that's exactly what they said, by the way. That's why they invoked Article 51 of the UN Charter. So we have to understand this mechanism, because failing to do so opens the door to all kinds of imaginary threats. And that's exactly what Emmanuel Macron just said. He invented, literally, a threat coming from Russia. So after having said during months and years that Russia is failing in Ukraine, is not able to take territory, has no tanks anymore, and so on and so on and so forth, today it becomes such a big threat that the European Union is obliged to have like a budget of 800 billion to create a kind of European army. So this is totally inconsistent. This has absolutely no sense. And we see that the Europeans, they don't have any other way of solving the problem, or let's say alleging solving the problem, other than expanding the problem. You see, what Emmanuel Macron suggested as peace plan is in fact an intervention in Ukraine. And how come this intervention made by 30,000 soldiers coming from the UK and France, how come these 50,000 people would change things? Nobody understands that, really. And I'm not sure that Macron has a clear view on that. Probably what he thinks is that we send those 3,000 people in Ukraine, and as soon as they start to be destroyed by Russians, we'll ask the US to intervene, and then we have the big war, and that will solve the problem. That is the only explainable way to understand what the Macron has in mind, because I don't see how you can involve these people, even if the Emmanuel Macron still calls these people, these soldiers, peacekeepers. But as I explained already on your channel, these will not be peacekeepers. There will be peace enforcers. And peace enforcers, meaning that you make war, essentially, with the idea of forcing your adversary to come to the negotiation table. But the Russians are ready to go to the negotiation table. So why would you enforce that? Because they are ready to do so. So what you should do, or what the Europeans should do, is to convince the Ukrainians to go on the negotiation table. But at the same time, they don't want to do so because they know that, as Trump rightly said, Zelensky has no cards. And therefore, it will be at the mercy of the Russians. And that's the reason why the Europeans want to be at the negotiation table. But on the other hand, why should they? They haven't participated. They haven't been they have been only part of the problem, but they never have been involved directly with the problem. They never been involved in trying to solve the problem. So why they want the Russians would like to have them? So we are in a kind of a strange situation in Europe today. Probably the best way for the Europeans is to stay quiet and to let the Americans do what they want to do, and pressing on both sides to have a negotiation. And then what happens, happens. But I think that what the Europeans are doing now is just noise, in fact. They are not improving things. They have not been, they have never been part of the solution. They're only part of the problem. And that's a little bit, this is kind of a pity, but we have discussed many times. This is also the quality of the leadership in Europe, which is extremely poor. At the European Union level, first of all, these are fanatics, where the voice of countries such as the Baltic states and Poland, the voice is extremely strong, disproportionately strong, I would say, as it is in NATO. And we can say, if we look at both organizations, if we, and regardless of what we think about Trump and all that, we could see that the US presence is in fact stabilizing in the NATO. Surprisingly, even if US has been at the origin of so many conflicts. But in the framework of NATO, US is stabilizing. Why? Because it's a nuclear power. And of course, if it gets involved, that means we are heading towards, or we might be heading towards nuclear war. So being a nuclear power, such as the US, gives some responsibilities. And that's probably the reason why we see more calm in the NATO than we have in the EU. And in the EU, we have now Emmanuel Macron, who is ready to share his nuclear dissuasion, or nuclear umbrella, if you prefer, with other European states. And here I have my doubts, because the the French nuclear dissuasion was built around the vital interest of France and based on the principle, on the strict sufficiency principle. That means that the nuclear forces of France have been drastically reduced in the early 2000s in order to fulfill a single objective, is to protect the vital interests of France. That's how they call them, vital interests. These vital interests have never been defined precisely. That's what they call the strategic ambiguity. Some have interpreted in the 80s or so that the vital interest would be the national territory. I mean, France as we see it on the European map, probably not the overseas territories that you may have in the Caribbean or in the Pacific area. This is probably not the vital interest. But the vital interest is probably the hexagon, as the French call them, which is the French territory in Europe. But again, we don't know. This is an assessment. In any case, the French have resized their nuclear arsenal to adjust it to this vital interest, which was reduced because of the end of the Cold War and all that. Today, if Macron wants to put this nuclear capacity at the service of other countries, that poses a lot of problems. First of all, that means that if they include, let's say, the Baltic states under this umbrella, that means that if you have some kind of provocation which might come, by the way, because remember, I said in Ukraine, the Russians have intervened because the Russians in Ukraine were mistreated. And if you consider that in the Baltic states, especially Estonia, Latvia, where you have a very strong Russian minority who don't have the same rights as other citizens. I think it's in Latvia, I may be wrong, but I think it's in Latvia, that the Russians are even non-citizens. So they have a European passport because Latvia doesn't issue a passport for these guys because it's a second-class citizens. You know, if you see that, if you put that in perspective, you would say, what happened if you Black African or American Black African in the United States would have a different passport than the whites? Everybody would scream about this. And that's exactly what you have in the Baltic states. And they don't have the same rights as other citizens. As a result, we may have a situation that prompts Russia to intervene. Now, if those countries are under a nuclear umbrella, what happens? Let's say you launch a missile on the Russians. Fine. Where does the second missile come from? From Russia. And where does it go to? On France. So that means that you have some fanatical country that may trigger a war and even destruction in France, even if the population has nothing to do with that. So it's a responsibility to share the nuclear dissuasion. And if we listen to Emmanuel Macron, and if I try to make an assessment of his last address on last Friday, I thought it was, I mean, every single sentence was a lie. It was a lie, literally. So when you have such leaders, how can you trust not just the maturity, but also the reliability of such leaders? And if they have the opportunity to launch or trigger a missile, I mean, that's destabilizing, clearly destabilizing. There are probably other issues that some have mentioned, probably non-proliferation and things like this. I haven't got the time to dig into that, so I don't want to talk about it. But the reality is, or the feasibility of this sharing of nuclear power by France is extremely debated, both in France and in other parts of Europe. So I'm not sure this will happen. But it shows that these leaders just throw in the air some ideas without even thinking about the consequence of it. And that, again, explains why the Russians don't really trust the Europeans. They are children, literally. This is kindergarten type of diplomacy, or not even diplomacy, but kind of foreign policy or security policy. Again, I don't know what the future will be. The Russians have never said they want to attack Europe, and there is no reason for that. We know exactly the reason why they intervened in Ukraine, and I don't see any reason for them to attack Europe. And even if they would do so, what would they do with Europe? I mean, let's assume Russia attacks Europe, and even it wins and it reaches Paris and things like this. Do they want to manage Europe? I mean, you know, this doesn't make sense at all. And I would say, at this stage, because now Europe is struggling to rebuild a military-industrial complex everywhere and mobilizing 800 billion for this and so on. The security policy, generally speaking, is based on two pillars: foreign policy, diplomacy, and defense policy. And both play together, not separately, together. And you may have, even if you are weak defense, you can compensate by having a good diplomacy and a good foreign policy. Of course, this goes to up to a certain point. But I mean, you have those two pillars and you have to play with those two pillars. And right now in Europe, we notice that we don't have any defense, but we don't play with the foreign policy. There is no foreign policy. They don't have common interests within Europe. The interests we have discussed before, Estonia has never got any interest for the southern part of Mediterranean. But the southern part of Mediterranean is an important partner for Europe. So how can you accommodate the national interest of, let's say, Italy or Spain with the national interest of Estonia? The national interest of Estonia is directed towards east, against Russia. The Portuguese don't care about Russia. But their problem is southwards, the relationship with Morocco, for instance, as for the Spaniards. So we see the difficulty in Europe to have a common understanding of foreign policy. We understand that. We could find some common grounds, such as the conflict in Ukraine, where you might have a less aggressive policy, something which is more appeased, and having trying to achieve more result. We could achieve that. On other topics, it's probably more difficult. But the problem is that the European Union has never managed, not even tried, to have a foreign policy that is integrated into a European security policy. It has no defense. That's the reason why they need 800 billion today. There's no defense. And they have no foreign policy. So they are lacking the two pillars of what is required for a good national security policy. You have both in, if you look France, for instance, again, it's not the best example as when we look at the persons, but institutionally, it's interesting to see for the president, for instance, the president of France has two responsibilities. He has a foreign minister and he has a defense minister. But in essence, the responsibility for the foreign policy and the defense policy is in the hands of the president. The two ministers, the respective ministers, are in fact just people who just implement the policy, period. But the policy itself is made by the president, and he has both. Because, as I said, the security policy is based on the defense policy and the foreign policy, both combined. And if you do that in an optimal way, then you have the right, you ensure the security of your country. That's what you see today with the US, for instance. What Trump is doing at this stage, probably at a later stage, he will do other things, because now it seems that he has this priority of solving the Ukrainian issue and the European issue. But we see that he's combining both the defense policy and the foreign policy as well. This is where we have to find a solution, an institutional solution in the European Union. Try to address those two pillars with sound policies, with sound objectives, with sound strategies. And that requires people who are a little bit wiser than Kaja Kallas and people who have absolutely no experience of that, who have absolutely no mindset for that, and who are not even willing to have peace. Their view, and remember what she said just a few months ago, when she said that the objective is to split Russia into pieces, basically the so-called decolonization of Russia. So how can you have a sound foreign policy with people saying that the aim of their the policy is to destroy your neighbors. It's impossible to have a foreign policy with that. So the changes in European Union, in my view, at this stage, should not be the number of billions you have to build weapons. It might be. I'm not against having more weapons. This is not the question. But this has to happen in a sound context, not just for the sake of having it. We should have in mind an idea, a main idea to have this defense policy adjusted to a foreign policy. But the foreign policy, we could do that without any billions, just some smart brains to do it, and the willingness, of course, to do it. That should be the first, the starting point of sound strategy and security policy for Europe. So these are let's say, the lessons beyond the conflict in Ukraine, beyond the conflict in Syria and Palestine. These are the lessons I'm drawing from this, from the situation. This is, first of all, we should solve our own institutional problems, to solve our intellectual problem, our mindset, or understanding of conflicts. Having the right picture of the conflict is the first step to solve them. If we start to build up a picture of the conflict, there is no way we'll solve it. The way Emmanuel Macron represents the conflict in Ukraine is the first step of failure in addressing the conflict. And in fact, when we see, he said in his address that Russia failed to implement the Minsk agreement. And when you go into the verbatim of what he said to Putin, we see that he was instrumental in destroying the Minsk agreement. He has not read them. He has not the capacity to understand them. He has no understanding of the spirit of these agreements. And again, this trying to solve a conflict based on his own prejudice is just a way to fail. Again, I repeat, and probably I have said that already, but we should remind what Sun Tzu said. Tactics without strategy is simply noise before defeat. Yeah. And that's exactly what we are witnessing in Europe today.
Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah. Thank you so much, Colonel, for being with us today. Great pleasure, as always.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.